A Death Knot by Odin Austin Schaefer. Sejuani slammed the axe into the tree trunks. It had taken her 5 hits to fell it, and hacking down a dozen trees had winded her. Icespawns were strongest in the cold, and the southern heat had sapped her strength. Her very reavers cheered, though only 100 strong. Their roar echoed off the hills. The time for stealth had passed. The southerners had gathered an army of many thousands and were less than half a day behind. On the surrounding hilltops, enemy scouts watched. The main body of Sejuani's forces were in the far north, occupied by summer, fatting herds, fishing and hunting. She had scattered small war parties along the Damascene border to destroy towns, burn crops and wreck keeps, hoping when winter came, her full horde could smash through these weakened lands and raid further south. Scar Maiden Kjalk approached Sejuani. Like the rest of the raiders, she rode a Djurvask, a boar-like creature larger than any ox. "War Mother, enemies gather on the other side of the river," Kjalk said, bringing her monstrous mount to a stop. "Show me," Sejuani replied, leaping onto her own Djurvask, Bristle. He was twice the size of his peers and as wide as a mammoth. Together, they rode down the hillside, passing warriors lashing their logs into rafts. She followed Kjalk along the riverfront until sweat dampened their mounts back. Downstream of a waterfall, just 300 paces across the river, the Damascene skirmishers were exiting the forest that had hidden them and climbing down the bare rocks. It was an advanced flanking force of a few hundred archers and spearmen. They spotted the 2 Freljordian women on the Djurvask, but continued their path. "Svang!" Sejuani spat on the flowing water in front of her. In winter, bogs, lakes and rivers like this one became frozen highways for her fast-moving war bands. A horn sounded, and Sejuani needed no scout to tell her that the main force of the enemy had arrived. She turned and could see their glimmering armor on the hilltops behind them. The Damascene plan was clear. If her warband tried to cross the river on rafts, the enemy skirmishers would rain missiles onto them, cutting her numbers in half. Then, using the high ground just beyond the riverbank, the spearmen would be able to hold her survivors long enough for the main force to catch up and overwhelm them. Bitter and raging, Sejuani kicked Bristle onward, and the giant beast ran, crashing through underbrush and shallows, back to where the rafts waited. Most of the warriors had already spotted the enemy forces and were preparing to flee along the river's edge. A fear had gripped them, not of battle, but of the trap the southerner had sprung. "The enemy will send riders to block off any escape along the riverside. We cannot stand against the army coming down from the hills. We must cross, now!" Sejuani commanded. Sejuani took a small piece of wood wrapped in leather, no larger than her thumb, and slipped it into her mouth. Then she uncoiled her great flare, Winter's Wrath. Each link of the weapon's chain was as large as a man's hand. At the chain's end hung a massive shard of true ice, the largest most had ever seen. Misty vapor rose from the magical cold. Sejuani clamped her teeth down on the leather wrapping stick to resist the pain of the weapon's magic, for wielding true ice always had a cost. Its cold frosted her arm, sending her into agony. Her eyes watered and tears froze like diamonds on her cheek. Yet all her warriors saw was a grimace of certainty and rage. She swung the weapon around her before crashing it into the water. A bridge of ice formed, but as she had expected, it immediately broke apart in the warmer currents. It could not hold her war party. A few arrows began to fall from the other side of the river. Archers testing their range. Few reached land, but she could hear the southerners' jeers. Sejuani set Winter's Wrath back, spat out the stick, and removed her helmet. Then she unwrapped the wolf god twine on her wrist. Seeing the simple act, her men roared in approval. A barking chant began. The warriors, no longer afraid, knew now they were witnessing something special. Sejuani was making the most sacred oath of her people. She would tie a death knot. She uncoiled her braids and deftly ran the wolf god through her hair. She wondered how many times she had taken a death oath. A dozen? More than any warriors known. Eventually, she would fall or fail. Would it be today? Arrows began to hit the shore around her as she bound the knot. A few of her warriors fired bolts back at the enemy, but the wind was against them. "I am Sejuani, War Mother of the Winter's Claw. I am Winter's Wrath. I am the flail of the northern winds," she cried as she tied the last triangular knot into her hair. "Even in death, I will hold the riverbank until you safely cross. This is my oath. I see the wolf, and my fate is tied." Her warriors cheered, voices growing hoarse as they tried to hold the sound longer. Many had eyes wet with emotion, for Sejuani had sworn to save their lives even at the cost of her own. She did not need to give them any further orders. They readied their weapons and climbed onto the raft. They would cross as quickly as they could, and perhaps they might arrive in time to save her. Sejuani placed a leather wrapping stick between her teeth. She ran her fingers through the wiry hair of Bristle's neck, who needed no oath or word to understand her intent. He grunted and turned to face the water. Again, she grabbed Winter's Wrath and swung it. Exhausted, in pain, and sweating in the heat, Sejuani brought it down onto the water. A bridge of ice formed as Bristle charged. The ice cracked and tilted, but her steed somehow ran true. Arrows fell, not the few exploratory shots from before, but a black rain. Sejuani held her shield high, though a few still stabbed her in her shoulders and thighs. Dozen pierced Bristle's hide. Then, barely halfway across the river, the bridge collapsed, and they were in the water. Bristle struggled. Desperately, he tried to hold them above the surface. Still, the arrows fell. The distant shore was gone. All Sejuani could see was rain of black balls and the water red from Bristle's blood. The great beast was screaming, with a sound like a thunderstorm and a baby wailing. Bristle sputtered. Without thinking, Sejuani leaned over his torso with her own, her shield covering his face to ease the mount's suffering. It was then she thought, perhaps our death comes today. Suddenly, Bristle found his footing in the shallows. Instead of drowning, the great beast made a huge splashing stride onto the riverbanks. Sejuani stood in her saddle and swung her flail in front of her, releasing an explosion of ice. The blast cut apart a dozen unarmored archers. Bristle gored and trampled another two. The others ran from her, back uphill, seeking cover behind the spearmen, who formed a shield wall to block her next attack. More missiles would rain down, and the spearmen would charge her in mass momentarily. But Sejuani grinned, knowing the archers had lost their opportunity. She looked back to see her own warriors crossing, unhurried by the barrage she had just withered. Sejuani still did not know if she would survive this day, but she had not failed her oath or her people, and that is what mattered. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes A Death Knot by Odin Austin Schaefer. If you want the full Sejuani lore, please go ahead and tell me in the comments. Also, you should totally subscribe because I release the new lore as soon as it's out. Oh well, I try. The next story on the channel is gonna be a Kaiser story called Monstrous. But until next time, enjoy.